Okay, hello everyone who's just joining. We're going to be starting shortly in a couple of minutes. Just a few quick things. This session is being recorded and there will be a live session going out as well. If you want to contribute to the discussion in any way with your insights or opinions, you'll see at the bottom of the page or on the right-hand side, there is a tab for comments. And as the presentations go on, if you have any questions which you want to direct to any of the speakers, there's a separate tab for Q&A. In that tab, if you could say who you are and where you're coming from in your organization, try to keep the questions quite concise and who you're directing your question to. As I say, we'll be beginning shortly.
Okay, thanks for that, Senan. So let's begin. On behalf of everyone at the Centre for Climate Justice, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our event this afternoon. Wherever you're joining us from, thank you for taking the time to be with us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tahseen Jaffrey and I'm the Director of the Centre for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University. Our focus is putting front and centre not only the difficult, personal and challenging conversations, but also clear scientific evidence and insights on the impacts that climate change is having on people and society from an injustice perspective. We provide education on climate justice via our unique Masters Climate Justice programme, and we are home to a growing number of climate justice doctoral students. Our event today, Intersectionality and Climate Justice, an Emancipatory Research Agenda. Intersectionality is concerned with the presence of and dynamics between different social categories, gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, and so on and so forth, and how they affect an individual's relationship to power. We recognise that intersectionality to some extent has been researched and analysed, but what doesn't seem to come across are concepts that connect or relate to the theoretical and methodological links and fundamental research on this interconnectedness between intersectionality and climate justice. We find that this field is limited in its research sphere. So by bringing together discourse on climate justice and intersectionality, we're able to challenge and renegotiate individual and systemic inequality and oppression. So with our three wonderful speakers today, this event is aimed at bringing together these concepts to exchange ideas and exploring new research needs and directions. So our speakers today, first of all, we'll hear from Michael Mikulovic, who is Research Fellow at the Centre for Climate Justice. Michael is a critical geographer by training, but has more recently been working on justice and development and is heading up our research portfolio on justice and intersectionality. And he'll be providing an overview of that theoretical and methodological links that exist, that link these two concepts together. Martina Angela Carretta is an assistant professor of geography at West Virginia University. She is a feminist with research interests in human-environment interactions and specifically looking at the human dimensions of water. Martina Angela will talk us through a case study on climate change, water scarcity, migration, and the gender nexus. Farhana Sultana is an associate professor and research director at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. She heads up the program for the advancement of research on conflict and collaboration. And today she will be providing us with a talk on conducting intersectionality research, informed research, and the role of the researcher in that context. So these presentations will be followed by a Q&A session. So if you would like to ask a question to either of our speakers, please do so in the Q&A box provided. So I think after that, we will have some closing remarks and we will make a few announcements before we close up for the day. So that provides an outline of the sessions this afternoon. So I think without further ado, we are ready to begin. So Michael, over to you for the first of our presentations.
Thank you, Cecile. Let me pull up my presentation. There we go. Okay, does this work?
It does.
Perfect. So thank you very much, Tessin, for this introduction, and hello, everyone. My name is Michael Mikulewicz, like Tessin mentioned, and I'm going to share with you some insights stemming from my preliminary review of research on climate justice and intersectionality and how these two fields overlap. And I'm going to do it from a theoretical and methodological perspective. And in terms of what I'm going to do, I'll first go over the concept of intersectionality and climate justice very briefly, and then I'm going to proceed to the main part of the presentation, which is climate justice and intersectionality theoretical and methodological links. And I'm going to conclude a word on critical environmental justice, which I think a lot of climate justice scholars can and should draw from in their work in the context of intersectionality. And then I'm going to leave you with some concluding questions rather than remarks, because I think that in my work and my review of these two traditions, I've encountered more questions than answers. So let's start. So what is intersectionality? And I wanted to select a pretty straightforward definition, which is intersectionality is the interaction between gender, race, and other categories of difference in individual lives, social practices, institutional arrangements, and cultural ideologies, and the outcomes of these. So here we are concerned with the complexity of our individual identities and how these identities, like Tessin mentioned at the beginning, determine our relationship to power structures and power relations in society. And as most of you will probably know, the term was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw. And I think one of the key contributions by Kimberly Crenshaw in this context, apart from the term itself, is also the observation that the intersection of experience is greater than the sum of these different axes of difference. So, for example, in my case, I'm a gay immigrant from Eastern Europe, living in the UK, but that doesn't mean that my life experience is defined by the sum of the experiences of a gay person and an immigrant. It's much more complex, much more nuanced than that. Kimberly Crenshaw from the beginning has said that race and gender are only two possible social categories to be incorporated into intersectional analysis. And ever since, there has been a flurry of literature suggesting different categories, additional categories. And you can see them here on this graph, situated along the axis of privilege, oppression, and domination. Now, obviously, this list isn't exhaustive. It's just these are just key examples, I would say. So how does intersectionality enter the debate on climate change, and how is it relevant in this context? So I think there is consensus within critical climate justice and climate change studies in general that intersection analysis can and should be applied to climate change, if not just for overcoming the single variable analysis that pervade the literature. So a lot of the articles and reports and contributions you will have read focus usually on one of these social categories: gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or class. Sometimes maybe two. But the point of intersectionality is that we should be looking at all the categories that are relevant in a given context, if we can identify them, if we can be aware of them. And following this path, one key early contribution of intersectionality to climate change studies has been that vulnerability is affected positively or negatively by privilege or oppression, respectively, by many axes of difference at once. And if we do not keep that in mind in our analyses, in our investigations, we run the risk of maybe protecting certain characteristics, but also increasing marginalization in other aspects that we might not be aware of. And just to give you some more practical examples of how this actually has been shown to be true, when you look at individual greenhouse gas emissions, for example, it has been shown to that these emissions are determined not just by wealth, but also gender and age. And another example is the exclusion of indigenous peoples, and especially of indigenous women, from climate policy making at different levels of climate and environmental governance. And also Farhana has contributed to this strand of the literature, where she has observed that vulnerability to floods in Bangladesh is not only based or ascribed to gender, but also caste, class, religion, and age, and that men also are a very fragmented group themselves. So that brings me to climate justice, and why are we talking about climate justice in the context of intersectionality? Climate justice, for those of you who have been attracted to this event by the intersectionality part, not so much the climate justice part, this is a definition that the Center for Climate Justice has come up with, following a literature review of the different definitions. We have found that climate justice recognizes humanity's responsibility for the impacts of climate change on poorest and the most vulnerable people in society, and addresses inequality and promotes transformative approaches. Now, this definition is vague, and it is deliberately vague because climate justice is a huge body of work, and there's no one single approach or solution to the problems we are facing. So I think the key words here is transformative, inequality, and poorest and most marginalized individuals and groups. So why climate justice? Why not climate change? Why not climate resilience or adaptation, mitigation, and so forth? So we have, in this critical field, we have observed that climate science has been dominated by prudential and economic terms, as Stephen Gardner has noted a while ago. And it's also dominated by disciplines such as engineering and natural sciences. But we have to keep in mind that climate change is not a natural phenomenon. It is having a profound effects on the world society. So even though it is manifesting itself through biophysical processes, it's anthropogenic, and I think that we can set that debate aside. And it also has, like I mentioned, having profound effects on different people. But what we want to underscore in climate justice scholarship is that these impacts are not uniform across time and space. And that's why we need an ethics-based approach to climate change policy, climate change analysis, research scholarship, and so forth. If we don't do this, we risk, in our view, we run the risk of producing solutions or policies, climate projects that essentially are ineffective and make no sense of the inequalities that these solutions can generate or exacerbate. So long story short, climate justice, activism, advocacy, and scholarship is the aim is twofold: to identify, foreground, and understand the needs of individuals and groups that are most marginalized in face of climate change impact, and in terms of our responses to them. So in terms of mitigation, adaptation, how does that translate? How does that mediate with the positionality of these individuals within society? So that's the more reactive side, and the more proactive side of climate justice, I would say, even more true to the core of climate justice, is the goal to dismantle those individual and structural architectures of marginalization and oppression towards these groups. So it's not just about analyzing the problem, it's also about finding political avenues for changing the situation and addressing these marginalizations and so forth. So, knowing all this, let's delve into the links between intersectionality and climate justice. And based on what I've just said, you probably can identify some of them already. So in terms of theoretical links, I've noticed that climate justice and intersectionality, unsurprisingly, and most fundamentally, focus on those most marginalized in society and on the power relations and structures causing their marginalization in the first place. So like I mentioned, it's not just about identifying these marginalizations. It's also about understanding why these marginalizations have come to be in the first place. Relatedly, both traditions advocate human emancipation, and the ultimate goal here is pursuing social justice and ending oppression of these marginalized groups that I've mentioned. And relatedly, both these approaches fight essentialism and stress the agency of the people often portrayed as vulnerable. In ecofeminist studies, for example, scholars have critiqued the view that women are closer to nature and we should follow women's lead in coming up with solutions to climate change, noting that women are a huge group of people forming half of the human population, over half actually, and we cannot essentialize that way because they are a very diverse group of people themselves. And then here on the right, you can see a picture of a disabled woman arrested during a peaceful climate protest in London not that long ago. One of the points of these two approaches is to question the underlying norms and institutions that govern social lives, or in other words, the norms and institutions that have led for the situation to this situation that you can see in this picture to happen. So why is a disabled elderly person arrested for taking part in a peaceful protest against the climate emergency? So that's something that's part of the theoretical links that I've identified. Some more here. I think a very important overlap between the two traditions is the need to question the dominant knowledges and the underlying knowledge production processes about social life, about social structures, but specifically, I think, in this case, our knowledge on human nature relations. So both climate justice and intersectionality afford agency or rights to non-humans. Intersectionality very often ventures into the non-human world to incorporate it into the intersectional analysis. And similarly, climate justice has some strands that include, like I mentioned, affording agency and rights to non-humans. So you've got here strands such as interspecies justice or justice for non-humans, and not just looking at the anthropocentric version of what climate justice should look like. Both intersectionality scholars and climate justice scholars are informed by multiple social theories that revolve around identity formation and power relations. So here, both sides draw from neo-Marxism or Marxism, feminism, anarchism, post-structuralism, queer theory, etc. And the thinking is that we have to select the most appropriate theories to explain what is going on the ground in terms of the marginalizations and oppressions. And this promiscuity in terms of theory, I think, is what also those two traditions have in common. Importantly, both intersectionality and climate justice underscore the need for political action, as opposed to the techno-managerial reforms that a lot of, I would say, mainstream or uncritical or orthodox approaches to solving the climate emergency suggest. And this is to be achieved by creating broad alliances and solidarity between oppressed groups and individuals, very importantly, based on common interests. So a shallow reading of intersectionality would suggest that these alliances should be based on identity, and that's not the case. We should be forging these alliances based on our common interests, and that is what these critical scholars, conservative political action in this context, advocate for. So these are the major theoretical links that I found, and I'm going to proceed to the methodological, more practical links right now. Interestingly, both climate justice and intersectionality, they both lack a defined methodology for good reasons. And that's because they both advocate for climate context-specific methods instead. And to kind of unpack that a little bit more, intersectionality, perhaps more explicitly climate justice, affords epistemic advantage to the marginalized groups and individuals. And what that means is that there's an understanding, an awareness that as scholars or practitioners or decision makers, we can only know so much about other people's marginalization. And the only way to present them correctly and to give them justice is to actually give voice to the people who are experiencing these oppressions and marginalization. So that's why a lot of this research is focused on lived experiences. And even though I said there's no clear methodology, no defined methodology in terms of climate justice or intersectionality, there nevertheless are some research methods that we can identify here that both traditions have mobilized. Here we've got participatory action research and public engagement, what David Pellow calls activist, scholar-inspired work or research. We've got ethnographies, life stories, case study research, interviews using storytelling techniques, and building oral histories. So definitely there are some overlaps in terms of the research methods that both fields use. And moving on to the more methodological links, what I found very interesting, probably because I'm a geographer, is that intersectionality and climate justice are very big on multi-scalar or cross-scalar analysis. And that's both in spatial and temporal terms. And that's done to capture the big picture. So we're not supposed to, the argument goes, we're not supposed to entrench ourselves on the local level, national, international, and global level. We're supposed to connect the issues across these levels spatially, as in this graph, or temporally. So extending our analysis into the past and also into the future. So, for example, to give you an example, understanding the current plight of Black Americans cannot be complete without considering the past experiences of slavery and colonialism in the Americas. And on the other hand, extending the scale into the future compels us to kind of think about what the future should look like and what kind of intersectional, climate justice-oriented future we want to build as a movement, as scholars, and so forth. And unsurprisingly, I've noticed that there's a lot of calls for interdisciplinarity within both intersectionality and climate justice, and that stems from the need for cross-scalar analysis and the need to understand the perspective of the other in addition to your own. So that requires the engagement of different disciplines and different fields of knowledge. And finally, and that's something that Farhana will also expand on, climate justice and intersectionality, they both compel us to reflect upon our own positionality as researchers, as practitioners, as policymakers, and so forth. And that can be as simple as asking Matsuda's asking the other question approach. So whenever you see something sexist, ask about how is it racist at the same time, or how it is heterosexist at the same time. So we as researchers, as practitioners, have to ask ourselves these questions constantly to ensure that these different marginalizations are not missing from the big picture, or else, as I mentioned, we can risk exacerbating them inadvertently. And just to conclude, I wanted to say a few words about critical environmental justice, because in my research review, this came up as a very, very relevant contribution to discussing the links between intersectionality and climate justice. Now, David Pellow has proposed 4 pillars for advancing a more critical environmental justice studies. And it's not climate justice explicitly, but in my view, climate justice is in many ways a cousin, or at least at the most a subfield of environmental justice. So there's definitely a lot we can draw from here. And one of these pillars is actually intersectionality, where David Pellow argues for the need to include multiple social categories of difference, including those more than human, that intersect to produce environmental justice and environmental racism. And he also notices the intersection of race and scale. And I'm not going to delve into the other two, but I highly recommend his work to all of you who think this is interesting. So the question for us here is, how does this apply to climate justice, and how can we mobilize these insights in our work for intersectional climate justice? And to leave you with some questions, I think that the overarching question for this event is, what should an emancipatory intersectional climate justice research agenda entail? And that's something that we will be hopefully discussing after the presentations have concluded. And some other ones include, what would an intersectional climate justice studies look like in practice? How can both approaches inform each other at the level of theory and praxis? What kinds of alliances do we need to forge to pursue intersectionally informed climate justice? And importantly, and perhaps more reflectively, whose voices and knowledges has climate justice favored and at the same time omitted over the last 30 years of work on this topic? And so that would be it from me. Thank you very much on behalf of myself and my wonderful dog. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Michael. You presented such a clear overview and insight into some of those links, and certainly the questions at the end. I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions around that. So thanks for providing that context. So now I think we'll hand over to Martina Angela, who's going to talk us through a case study, and let's have a look at the applications of some of these things. So thanks, Michael, and over to you, Martina.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, hi everyone. I'm happy to be here with you today, and thank you so much, Michael and Tassin, for organizing this. Michael and Tassin said in the introduction, I'm an assistant professor in geography at West Virginia University, and I'm also a coordinating lead author for the IPCC Working Group 2, and particularly I'm coordinating the chapter on water, vulnerability, and adaptation. So the work that I'm presenting today to you is work that I did for the World Water Assessment Program for UNESCO, and is also work that is complemented with more recent literature. So what I'm going to be focusing on today is whether there's a linkage between climate change, water scarcity, and migration, and how that can be understood from a gender and a youth perspective. So Michael finished his presentation with a couple of questions. He asked, what would an intersectional climate justice study look like in practice, and what kind of alliances do we need to forge to pursue intersectionality informed climate justice? So I'm not here to claim that the presentation that I'm giving today will give a full answer to any of those two questions, but it is certainly a step in the direction of trying to compose an answer to those questions. In fact, my presentation revolves around, and the study that I did revolved around finding connections between climate change, water insecurity, conflict, and migration, and doing that from the standpoint of climate justice, and particularly the aspect of intersectionality, particularly looking at gender and age, because there was an interest to understand who are the people that are most vulnerable in the context of water insecurity induced by climate change, and what kind of adaptation measures do they put in place. And this work, like I said, was done for UNESCO, and so it was conducted by scholars, but it was used by this international organization to actually put in place programming. So here you have an example of the kind of alliances that are possible to forge when using an intersectionality lens. So now delving into the topic, we know that climate change leads to increased climate variability, which is manifested in extreme weather events, for instance, floods and droughts. And we know that 75% of natural disasters are actually water related. And climate change in this sense is shaped to trigger water insecurity, both in the forms of lack of water, but also deterioration of water quality. So then the questions from an intersectional perspective becomes, who suffered the most from this vulnerability? Who suffered the most from water insecurity? One way, one example to look at that is the people whose livelihoods are put in jeopardy by climate change induced water insecurity. And one example of those is the agricultural sector in the global south. The question then becomes, who works in that sector? Often we find that it is the subsistence farmers, women, young men, elderly men that are at the risk of losing or have already lost part of their livelihood. And that triggers gendered specific strategies to diversify a risk. We know there's extensive literature around how men and women adapt differently to climate change in agricultural contexts, for instance, by adopting different cultivars or changing their cultivation patterns. So there's lots of documentation around agricultural practices, but then one also important strategy that is put in place is the strategy on migration. Migration can be seen as an adaptation measure, but it can also be seen as an indicator of the limits to adaptation to environmental stress. Migration can be seasonal, for instance, in relation to the agricultural cycle. And in this case, it tends to be often male dominated, and it is in response to a low onset environmental change, like I said, like changes in rain patterns can be. But then migration can also be permanent in response to quick onset environmental disasters like floods, landslides, fires. It is important to note that what the literature underlines about climate change induced migration is that most often it leads to internal displacement rather than international migration. This is an important aspect to keep in mind. And just to give you some numbers, there are projections that estimate that between 31 and under 43 million people will be internally displaced by 2050 in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. And the EU asylum application will increase, a projection lead to think that the EU asylum application will increase between 98,000 to 660,000 per year due to environmental change. So what remains to be understood and where science and evidence is advancing is whether we can make a full connection between climate change, water insecurity, conflict, and migration, and whether the question for my study was whether that can be looked at from the lens of gender and age. So there is a limited evidence on the link between climate change, climate change-induced water insecurity and conflict. One study, for instance, estimated the climate change influence between 3 and 20% of conflict risk over the past century. A typical example would be of that dynamic would be there's more erratic rainfall, it reduces water availability, arable land availability, and that incentivizes violence to try to get resources somewhere else. But does that lead to migration? That is the question where the linkage is less clear. And that depends on the local and national institutions that are in place. When we think about local institutions, we can think about natural resource management arrangements, like, for instance, say irrigation committees or community groups that work around forest management, which are really the social capital of communities around the world. And that social capital also then leads this community to actually have or not the capability to negotiate new environmental conditions with the neighboring communities and in that way avoid conflict. But then when we talk about local institutions, we also think about the gender specific roles. Who is it that that is in a position to be able to be resilient and bounce back if there's a quick onset environmental shock? And who has actually the adaptive capacity to change their practices depending on changing environmental conditions? Who has, like I said in the previous slide, the possibility to actually change or move to alternative livelihoods. And that is very gender specific. When we look at national institutions, we can ask ourselves the question, so do states have the capability to provide relief, to respond to humanitarian crises? And when they do, who is it that they consider to be the head of the household? And which kind of policies are put in place in terms of support, for instance, to the agricultural sector? One example that is often brought up is the example of the deregulation of agricultural subsidies that happened in Syria, which reduced the subsidies to agriculture, and that coupled together with the 2006 to 2010 drought was one of the many factors that triggered the uprising. So we see how water governance and environmental management policies and practices are crucial at the local and the national level, because if they are lacking, then conflict can happen, and that can possibly lead to migration. And when we talk about migration, if we look at it from the standpoint of gender and age, then we can analyze basically 3 different stages. So there's a pre-migration stage where we see loss of livelihood, which is manifested, for instance, in women's nutrition being at stake, and the male unemployment, which often leads to more violence, whether against women and children. And then when the decision to migrate happens, the likelihood to migrate depends on one's positionality and the cultural background of the area from where the person is migrated. For instance, if we take droughts that triggered migration in Ethiopia, we see that droughts actually reduce the mobility for marriage-related migration for women, but the reverse actually happened in Mali and Nigeria. So we cannot, make a blanket statement and say, okay, drought actually trigger or does not trigger migration for women. What we can generally say, though, is that seasonal migration, it has been shown that is dominated by men, and women resort to using gardens and small-scale agriculture. At the migration stage, we see male out-migration first, and that results in remittances, which improve the household livelihood, the household conditions. It also, and when men are away, then women's control over household resources increase, but at the same time, women continue being excluded from resource management institutional forums, like where I did my PhD, for instance. When men would leave, women could still not participate in the irrigation committee meetings, so they could not have a say on when they needed to actually receive irrigation water. The second step that we see in the migration stage is what is defined by scholars as the feminization of migration, which is manifested through the disintegration of families, as women are the ones that are considered to be caring for the home, the children, and the overall family well-being. And that falls apart once women migrate. At the post-migration stage, we see men and women experiencing integration in the new societies in different ways. That depends on their age. It also depends on work eligibility requirements. Women, it is noted that women are often most, the ones that are most rejected in terms of their application for citizenship in other countries. It has been shown that women become more dependent on their husbands in post-migration settings. But for instance, the reverse has also been shown in Jordan, where Syrian women were more at ease actually in getting into the service industry. So unidirectional conclusions can basically not be drawn, and they are, like Michael said in the previous presentation, very much context and depending on the intersectionality axis that you look at. I'm going to conclude by giving an example of where there might be a potential nexus here between the things that I mentioned, climate change, water insecurity, conflict, and migration. And that example is the example of the Sahel and the Mediterranean route of migration. So water scarcity in the Sahel is manifested through drought. We know that 65% of the African population is exposed to climate change related risk, but they only receive 5% of climate related funding. And the population that lives in this continent is defined as 70% of them are mostly young, and they are dependent on a single agricultural livelihood. So when water scarcity is manifested through natural disasters as floods and droughts, then they lose their only source of livelihood, and that creates unemployment, which results, as it has been widely shown, in seasonal and circular migration between rural and urban areas in the Sahel and West Africa. And what has also been shown is that after several years of remittances and accumulating resources, then these men often try the route of the Mediterranean and migrating to Europe. So in lieu of a conclusion, I also decided, as Michael did, to end with a few questions, which actually highlight where there are substantial gaps in research at the intersection of climate justice and intersectionality, particularly in relation to water insecurity and migration. And these questions are: how are different intersectional axes manifested into the vulnerabilities related to water insecurity? That would be at the pre-migration stage. What are different intersectional outcomes of climate change induced migration? That would be at the migration stage. And how is access to water resources in the host communities or countries experienced intersectionally by different people? And with that, I'm through with my presentation. I thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to getting your questions at the end of this. Thank you.
Many thanks, Martina. And it was really interesting to hear the different stages of migration. I think it was really refreshing to see something like that, and it's very understandable the way you've presented it and it's come across. So many thanks for your thoughts and those questions. I'm sure we'll pick up on them later on in the day. So with that in mind, I think I would now like to hand over to Farhana for her thoughts on our talk this afternoon. So over to you, Farhana.
Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to folks from around the world. And thank you to Michael and Tassin for the invitation to speak today. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach to build on our conversations today to talk about climate justice and intersectionality. First of all, I don't have a PowerPoint, but second of all, I would just like to bring in some insights and reflections. So you've heard about kind of conceptual and theoretical issues that Michael talked about, but and you've heard about the case studies that Martina talked about. I'm going to bring in issues around researcher experience, responsibilities of researchers who work on climate justice and intersectionality, and what to keep in mind when researching and fighting for climate justice and intersectionality in climate justice. So my perspective is informed by my being both an academic researcher who works on climate issues intersectionally, and as someone from the global South where climate injustices and climate breakdown have been occurring for a very long time and unevenly so. So for much of the global North, climate change seems to be occurring now or sometime in the future. However, in much of the global South, climate change has been occurring for a long time already, where people have been talking about it, writing about it, living through it, or dying from it. My lived experiences and research experiences from Bangladesh, a severely climate impacted country, thereby inform these brief insights I'll share with you today, which I hope you'll find useful. So in broad terms, we know that climate justice is about systems change and addressing structural inequities and power relations that uphold those inequities. As was already mentioned, critical approaches to climate justice look at issues of responsibility, exposure, vulnerability, ethics, and care. To have justice, we need to first identify the various injustices that exist and then look at the underlying causes of them so that we can start to tackle them. As a result, climate justice research and action necessitates deploying an intersectional approach to be more comprehensive in our accountability to various systemic injustices. Climate justice work is beginning to heed the insights from various strands of critical scholarship, and because groups are not homogeneous, but yet have largely been treated as such in many policies and planning, insights such as intersectionality have gained traction to help nuance data and explain on-the-ground realities in more representative and accountable ways. The importance of intersectionality in doing climate research are many, but largely because, in policy language, excuse me, it is a value added that necessitates disaggregated data requirements, but also gets behind such data, and therefore can help formulate policies and projects that don't further marginalize people and reproduce various socio-ecological inequities. This requires close understanding of local contexts and complexities, as well as engagement with insights from evolving bodies of scholarship and theories. An intersectional lens allows for better understanding of the lived experiences of those who are coping with and having to adapt to climate change. It helps explain some root causes of inequities, oppressions, and power structures that interplay with climate breakdown that create variegated vulnerabilities, risks, adaptive capacities, and ongoing climate injustices. It helps visibilize the contours of climate injustices in places and across scales, and illuminates the overlapping crises that are occurring simultaneously. Such attention also allows for better understanding of the embodied lived experiences of climate impacts, thereby humanizing climate change that is still largely approached in techno-managerialistic and scientific ways. While there are valid concerns that the concept of intersectionality may have been co-opted and deployed problematically in various institutions, and that there has been some token buzzword usage around it, which takes it out of its context of its radical and feminist roots, in my opinion, to not heed intersectionality in the research process or in policy debates can result in even more problematic outcomes and reductive conclusions. With the rise of research on adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage internationally, it becomes more urgent for researchers to reclaim the possibilities of doing accountable and transformational research that is justice-oriented with careful and thoughtful intersectional approaches. This is neither easy nor is there a consensus on how to do this, but we can start some conversations, hopefully without reproducing neither victimizations nor damaged narratives, or what is sometimes euphemistically called poverty porn. So how can one think of doing intersectional research in climate justice, and what are some important things to keep in mind in the research process? I'll share some ideas which are by no means exhaustive nor prescriptive, so I encourage viewers to engage more critically with scholarly material that's out there on this. Some of the more common axes of intersectional difference or oppression in researching climate justice, in my experience, have been gender, race, ethnicity, class, disability, age, sexuality, religion, caste, livelihood, and migrant status. But all intersectional research in climate justice has to be locally grounded and account for local axes of oppression and exploitation and marginalization, and how they interplay with wider scales of exploitation, oppression, and marginalization. So as a result, when doing this kind of research, we need to be contextually mindful, because what makes sense in one context may not in another. So while gender power relations and gender inequities have been key entry points for undertaking intersectional research in academic scholarship and international policymaking for some time, we must recognize that gender is not static. It is relational and consists of various power relations that are also contextual. Gender power relations exist globally, which is why it has become a key entry point of doing this kind of research. However, gender doesn't sit in isolation from other axes of power relations, but is co-constitutive of the relevant axes of privileges and oppression. This does not mean pursuing an endless set of variables of social categories or identities, but pursuing understanding and shedding light on the main axes of oppression and social vulnerabilities and marginalizations that are relevant in each context in order to be able to address patriarchal power relations. In addition to gender, class has become a key social marker that is co-constitutive of gender, which is why so much of climate justice research expounds on the differences of climate impacts across rich and poor groups, and the intersectionalities of gender and class in capitalist oppression. In many contexts, race or ethnicity become important intersectional differences to heed, especially in racialized or indigenous communities that are positioned marginally compared to settlers and dominant groups. But each community nonetheless still has its own gender and class dynamics internally and in relation to other groups externally. As a result, researchers are usually mindful of doing household level, community level, and wider scale analysis to explain the variegated challenges and power dynamics that exist. There are overlaps and interplays that exist and need attention. Such attention also needs to be extended to historical and spatial analyses to understand not just the different systemic barriers, but geopolitical factors involved. This is because legacies of colonialism and ongoing colonialities reproduce various layers of oppression across space and scales, which are important in intersectional research, in my opinion. Thus, paying attention to climate justice and intersectionality fosters attention to differences in vulnerability, resilience, coping, and adaptation strategies and abilities in the context of climate breakdown. However, just identifying points of difference and exclusions are just the starting point. They are certainly not the end point. The goal is to expand local agency and voice so that marginalized people are heeded and heard in the corridors of power for greater equity and justice on the ground and for structural change. This therefore includes working with local leaders, groups, organizations, and institutions, while also paying attention to local power dynamics to see who is excluded or left out. For instance, as was highlighted earlier, water stress and insecurity compounds gendered inequities where women and girls are responsible for household water provision daily. This can occur during droughts, which are increasing with climate change, but also during floods and storms, which are also worsening with climate change. And this water insecurity occurs for a range of reasons, such as potable water sources becoming precarious, or few and far between, or expensive to access, or socially challenging to access for different reasons, or various institutional barriers that may be in place. However, it is not all women and girls or different gender minorities, since these vary by class and race, because different people have different privileges. And it can also include different groups of men and boys who participate in domestic water provision. My own work in water insecurities and politics in the Global South in areas of climate distress have demonstrated this. Furthermore, some of the work I've undertaken in both rural and urban areas facing variegated climate impacts demonstrate how social inequities play out on the ground over time as flooding, tropical cyclones, heat stress, droughts, water logging, land erosion, and other climate impacts compound sufferings across groups and peoples. This leads to various coping strategies as well as alterations in how people perceive their roles in their own democracies and enact their citizenship rights, while they are also subjected to various forms of othering and silencing simultaneously. As a result, critical and nuanced analyses of these issues open up opportunities to address inequities and thereby encourage equitable changes. So what all this demonstrates is that understanding of local power dynamics and local structures is vital. We're witnessing that climate change exacerbates intersectional power relations largely across gender, class, race, and other axes significantly in the Global South, but also in the Global North, especially in racialized communities and indigenous communities. This is why international, interdisciplinary, and intersectional research enriches our overall understanding and abilities to act across scales and sites. So for instance, while livelihood opportunities, loss of livelihood opportunities, extreme weather events, water insecurity, crop failures, and other climate-related facts can lead to outmigration, the majority of people facing climate breakdown globally are often trapped populations or those without viable options or needs to migrate. They cope and adapt the best they can where they are. However, this can also lead to changes in intersectional power relations over time, which thus need to be engaged with. The lived experiences of climate injustices are important to heed temporally and spatially, as they demonstrate the differential vulnerabilities and marginalizations that are occurring or exacerbating. So to undertake an intersectional research in climate justice ethically and to learn more about what to keep in mind in the research process and thereafter, my first suggestion is to read up on and learn from different methodological approaches, especially insights from feminist, indigenous, decolonial, and critical race scholarships, among others. Feminist methodological insights such as positionality, critical self-reflexivity, intersubjectivity, ethics of care, accountability, reciprocity, inclusivity, co-producing knowledge, and critical praxis are important, in my opinion, in undertaking intersectional climate justice work that has the potential to be meaningful, ethical, and useful to people on the ground. To work towards emancipatory changes, one must engage with various structures, institutions, and communities in ethical yet critical ways. Thus, integrating qualitative and quantitative methods means being careful and thoughtful in research design, in carrying out fieldwork or other research methods, in the writing up process, in dissemination and wider engagement. Methodological innovations are thus important in undertaking climate justice and intersectionality research. For instance, storytelling of lived experiences can be insightful methodological tools as they get beyond and behind the numbers and stats that are more readily shared. Similarly, countermapping and other ethnographic approaches can be helpful. There are various methods and tools that can be used, but in my mind, the epistemological and methodological insights from various bodies of critical scholarship help inform better research and policymaking in the end. A lot of this includes accounting for the researcher's role, but also ensuring that people have a voice. Lastly, intersectionality approach in climate justice goes beyond just analysis and explanation, but exploring opportunities to build solidarities, agency, and collectivities against systemic inequities and oppression. It offers possibilities to explore strategies of resistance and emancipatory transformations. It allows for better policymaking and project planning to reduce climate-related vulnerabilities and crises, for encouraging long-term commitments to address structural, societal, institutional barriers, and for enacting ways to reduce inequities while fostering relationships of mutuality, aid, and respect. In conclusion, climate justice research that is intersectional can thus provide ways to begin to address institutional and systemic challenges that compound impacts of climate change across scales and locations. I invite everyone to contribute more towards this. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Farhana. You've taken us through a journey of how we can conduct our research and some of the key methodologies that you need. And as academics looking at this, the key is always in the methodology. If you get the methodology right, then the data stacks up. But I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of questions on that at in the Q&A chat. So many thanks again to you, Farhana. I'm just quickly going to hand over to Senan, who's just going to go through the Q&A logistics before we head into that session. So Senan, over to you.
Everyone, just to remind you, if you want to ask a question to any of our presenters, at the bottom of your Zoom application, you'll see the Q&A tab. If you could type your questions there, tell us what organization you're coming from, be quite concise in the answer if you could please, and let us know who you're directing your question to. We have a few questions already, but please feel free to add them in that Q&A function at the bottom.
Great, Senan, thanks very much. I wonder if you could just put our holding slide back to the Q&A, if you wouldn't mind. Thanks very much. Okay, so I can see we have a whole raft of questions here, quite lengthy ones, so I will try and handle this as best as I can. First question comes from Murtada Mohammed. Let's see, my question is, why do you think that this is the only right way to look at our problem at first place? So looking at intersectionality in terms of the concept is based on this assumption that humans are on race to power and socialize, and they're split into, you know, oppressors and oppressed. Is this the correct way to approach the subject matter? I'm wondering, Farhana, I'm going to direct that at you, if you wouldn't mind kicking off with that one.
Sure. If I understood the question correctly, why are we looking at injustices and oppression Why? Well, because injustices and oppression exist, because there are different forms of oppression, that there are people who are oppressed and there are oppressors. To deny that is to be quite blind, in my opinion, to the status of the world right now. What we're trying to kind of underscore is that it is not a desire to go looking for, different ways, right? But then to recognize that, there's some real ugliness in the world. And if we don't look at what's going on, we're just going to kind of not recognize problems that exist, and therefore we're never going to address them. So that is the positionality that I'm coming from, because there are oppressors and oppressed in the world. We're trying to showcase how it's relational, that you may be oppressed in one context, but you may be the oppressor in another. What makes sense in the pursuit of climate justice, whether globally or locally? And I'll just kind of add to that, to round that out, that question. An important part of climate justice and intersectional research is to not only account for those relational privileges that exist in communities and between researcher and communities, but in frontline communities that are battling climate injustices, these kind of different forms of oppression become real touchstones. And it becomes really important, so therefore, to be able to have people tell their stories while the researchers does not appropriate their voice or devalue their labor. So it often means decentering ourselves and letting people speak about their own experiences. And this involves active listening and working with instead of speaking for. And therefore we can support kind of local political efforts and transnational solidarities and cross-scalar action. But to deny that problems exist is not going to help us achieve those goals in my mind.
Many thanks, Farhana, for handling that question. I'm just going to, rather than having everybody's answer to the same question, I'm just going to whiz through the questions and guide them differently. There's an interesting one that's come in from Emma Colvin. And her question is, how do you see the increased interest in Black geographies and engagement with racial capitalism relating to a more intersectional approach to climate justice? Michael, I wonder if I could direct that one at you, if you wouldn't mind handling that.
Sure. I think there are definitely a few intersections that we can identify here and relationships. I mean, if you look at the work of Laura Pulido from the University of Oregon, she is making the case that environmental racism and environmental injustice is necessary for racial capitalism to exist in the first place. So here we've got the argument that we have to produce that difference between people to produce differential value, so that we can generate profit. Now this is entering the I would say kind of Marxist analysis a little bit, but there are definitely questions that we can, these are two questions, environmental injustice and capitalism, that we can easily connect. And even now, leaving the neo-Marxist analysis behind, if you look at the post-colonial perspective, having in the United States, having this history of slavery and colonialism essentially determines people's experiences of capitalism and of oppression today. So I think Black geography's engagement with racial capitalism is definitely something that we'll be seeing more and more, especially given what is happening in the United States right now. And I think more and more people will be seeing these connections of, the plight of Black Americans being connected to the political class being allied with capitalist elites, or being capitalist elites in some, according to some observers, and having this experience of a population being historically subjugated. That is very important to notice in this analysis. So I think this is just from the top of my head, but I do think there's intersections here that we should be looking at, and I do recommend Laura Pulido's work on this, because she is way more eloquent in making these connections than I am.
Many thanks, Michael. A question that's come in, I'm going to direct this one at Martina Angela, because I think it relates to maybe give some experiences from the case study that you've done. It's a kind of a general question, Martina Angela, around how can we structure research partnerships that embody emancipatory a vision, and how do you encourage or to give research partners space and voice and acknowledgements are some of those things that came through in the work that you and your experiences in the case studies that you've done.
Yeah, so I think here you have in the panel 3 people that can probably call themselves critical geographers. They call themselves critical geographers, and to be able to do critical geography, you need to have a pretty clear understanding of what participatory methods entail. And so my research has been grounded in participatory methods ever since. And a way to do that is that you bring in your community partners from the very start. As a scholar, you might have some theoretical interests, like we all have theoretical interests around, for instance, climate justice and intersectionality, but then what are the questions that communities actually want you to ask that then you can repackage, if you wish, for your scholarly community, but that can also be helpful for the local community. And so that is the way that I've personally always conducted research. So even the way that I put together like research questions, that is done in consultation with the communities that I work with. Methods are decided in consultations with the communities that I work with. They are my gatekeepers, and they help me figure out who are the interviewees, for instance, who are the participants to the focus groups that I will carry out. And then summary, and then I carry out something called member checking, which is basically a preliminary analysis of results with them. Before I even carry out like a full analysis of results, I present them with basically like a situation where I say, okay, I think I've understood this from what you guys told me. Did I understand this correctly or not? And that actually refines the quality of the data, adds details to it. And then way before this ever gets published, years before, communities already have in their hands summaries of results and can move with those summaries to policymakers. And if I can connect actually with the previous question that was asked, I can actually give an example of some research that I'm carrying out that clearly shows where environmental injustice is, moving and happening here in the US. So I'm currently carrying out research on fracking and pipelines across the US, looking at who are the people that are most impacted by these energy infrastructure. And one case that is interesting and that is very commonly mentioned in the environmental justice literature here in the US is the case of the so-called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where lots of petrochemical industries are located just literally in the backyard of a lot of African American communities. These are places where we now see the impacts of like hurricanes, more frequent hurricanes every season. So oil companies now say, okay, we need to look for a more, what they literally say, climate resilient place in the US where we can move our production. And this production is now being moved at the Ohio River Valley in Appalachia, where yet again, there is a marginalized population of unemployed people and former steel towns that have become completely empty. And here comes yet another potential economic development that is basically taking advantage of people that do not have the resources to look for another livelihood, okay? And so here again, I'm carrying out research, the same type of research I've carried out in the Global South. I'm doing the same in Appalachia, asking the same questions here too, and asking people to contribute to the questions in the same exact way through participatory means. So I hope that answers.
That's great. Thanks, Martina, for that explanation. Farhana, I've got a question for you on methodology. The question comes from Badsha Sarkar. And he's wondering around all the different axes of intersectionality, the reference that they can't all be addressed at the same time. And the question is, can you highlight if any of the axes of intersectionality can be prioritized over other axes in terms of your approach and methodology?
Yes, of course. So in my talk, what I mentioned is that some of the key axes of difference that exist across communities are usually gender and class, which is why those have been the most dominant approaches that scholars have taken. So intersectionality between gender and class, but it also, again, needs to be contextual. So it depends on where you are. So if you're working in racialized environments, then race becomes important in addition to gender and class. If you're working in semi-homogeneous ethnic groups, then ethnicity or race isn't as important as perhaps, let's say, caste or migrant status. So this is where good research comes in, that you have to be mindful of what are the key entry points and then what makes sense in that context. So some of the more common ones are gender and class and race and ethnicity, but not all communities will have racialized differences. They may have it at larger scales, but maybe not within the community that you're working at. So to be mindful of that and then addressing local dynamics, but situating the local dynamics within broader tapestries of power relations, so global capitalism, issues of international development, issues of ongoing colonialism. So just being mindful of that, but paying attention to what are the key entry points. And some of the most common key entry points are intersectionalities of gender, class, and race or ethnicity.
Thanks, Farhana. And I wonder if I could just stay with you. I've got a plea from a PhD student who's, trying to conduct ethnographic context-based work, and any pointers as how she can do this remotely.
All right. Yes. So this is a challenge. All of our PhD, doctoral, and master's students are kind of grounded this year because of the pandemic hell that we're living through. So the advice is that, first of all, you need to be safe. So you may not be able to do your research, and you need to work with your advisor and institution to figure out how to extend your funding or your PhD program. That's kind of how we're dealing with it in a lot of American doctoral programs, PhD programs. But in instances where that is not possible because it's a time limited or funding limited package and you have to get done, there are other ways people are trying to approach this. They're trying to reorient. So if you can't really do proper ethnographic work, because ethnographic work means you have to be immersed in the communities in which you're doing research, because there's various methods, right? Participant observation, questions, oral histories, and so on, or transect walks or counter mapping. So some folks have been trying to do this virtually as we're doing it right now, but then that also has built-in inequities. Not everybody has access to internet or technology. Others are trying to do as much as they can with local partners that they've established, maybe through telephones, or they're just simply delaying and doing other work, maybe doing the archival work, or doing other kind of literature work, and then pushing back field work to when it's safer to travel, and not just safer for you, but safer for communities that you're going to be engaging with, right? Because that, again, is part of what being an ethical scholar means, to not expose communities to further harm. So there's no easy answer, but if you already have established relationships, you can try to build on those. If you don't at all, it might be a time to reorient your project, or refocus it, flip the order of doing things, or see if you can delay and argue for kind of like a small gap in between your studies. Because I think the important thing is to keep everyone safe at the moment.
Thanks Farhana for doing that. And I'm wondering, Martina, Angela, whether you can handle a question that's coming up, and then I've got one for you, Michael. So the question is, how do you differentiate intersectionality and feminist political ecology? How can you differentiate them, or can we combine them together?
Okay, so, well, first of all, I think actually Farhana just answered to that question in the other chat, because we have two chats going on. So we're kind of like looking at questions on both ends. So I'm just gonna point in that direction first, and then I'm gonna say that it is a different approach, okay? Because intersectionality is used in multiple disciplines, okay? Feminist political ecology is more of a geographical approach, okay? So my read and my understanding of it has always been that you can have a feminist political approach and look at it through intersectional lenses. And again, that is coming from a perspective of a geographer that would first approach the field through that theory and then realize, okay, looking at gender is not enough because this is not like the main component or the only component where marginalization emerges. And so at that point, then you would integrate other elements. So yes, the two are combinable, but then again, which is the real question for me to the person that asked the question is, which discipline are you coming from? Because different disciplines have different approaches.
Yeah. So it's really good to hear the different perspectives from different speakers, and it's nice to get that mix of different thoughts coming through. Michael, I have a question for you. Whilst it's true that there's a need to shift from a technocentric and masculine climate justice research focus, how can we ensure that we get a policy buy-in for climate justice? And I guess it relates to another question that comes in is, how do we ground or foreground intersectionality so we get real change on the ground in terms of policy and practice, so it doesn't remain conceptual?
Yeah, I think I can think of two ways, two related ways in which we can kind of help the policy world overcome that focus on masculinist understandings of issues, environmental issues included. The first one is trying to speak the language of the policymakers, as difficult as it may be for critical scholars like ourselves. If we want to have practical effects of our work and see them in real life, we do have to meet them halfway. We can have, I have no qualms about having a hidden agenda in how I approach them, but you do have to sell your ideas in such a way that responds to what their expectations are. And if they are more responsive to quantitative data, then perhaps you should complement your research with quantitative analysis that would only support your qualitative findings, or your qualitative analysis. So that's kind of almost like subverting the policymakers and kind of selling your message through with using a language that that they understand. And the second one, maybe a little bit less intuitive, maybe a bit counterintuitive even, is to vote, because policymakers are appointed very often by elected officials. And you can imagine the differences on the political spectrum between a policymaker or decision maker appointed by, I'll say President Donald Trump, and somebody like AOC or Bernie Sanders in the countries of America. There will be two different decision makers, two different people with two different sets of values. And that way we can start changing policy from within. And maybe that way, eventually, although this is a very long process, policymakers will change the policymakers, not the way they view things, but we will replace the people who probably shouldn't be making decisions on marginalized people because they don't understand them and they don't understand the plight that they are facing. So I think a political action as well is a way to deal with this.
Thanks, Michael, for that. And I've got there were quite a few questions on the same subject about how we move discourse around the subject matter so it gets out of being very conceptual to something practical. And there's a raft of questions on that. But I'd like to move on a little bit and just talk about the differences of how climate justice and intersectionality appears differently in the UK and the US or in other parts of the world. I wonder if you could give just a quick, very concise snapshot of that, if I can get round you all. Farhana, if I could start with you and then come to Martina and then to Michael.
So the question is how it looks different in the UK versus the US. I think I misunderstood.
Yeah.
In terms of research that is being done or what's happening on the ground?
Debates and discussion.
Oh, debates. I don't know if there's a specific contour of difference between academic debates in the UK versus the US, except because there's a lot of crossover lab, there's a lot of collaborations happening. But in the US, questions of race are much more important, I think, than they are in the UK. The UK also, because of its colonial past, is much more engaged in research and action and policy interventions in the global South. Largely in Africa and Asia and Latin America through what used to be the DFID. I think it's rebranded itself. But in the US, there is that because of issues of racial injustices within America, there's much more focus on how to engage in climate justice issues at home, while scholars are still talking about it abroad. Another difference that I think is happening here that is not happening as much in the UK is talking about Indigenous climate justice, because you have Native American and First Canadians in Canada, and so in North America and across the Americas, you have Indigenous populations who are oppressed through 500 years of colonialism. So there's that intersectionality between race and indigeneity and ethnicity that are much more predominant in the climate justice discussions and scholarship in the US. Sometimes to the detriment of not taking into account international scholarship or engaging with, let's say, anti-colonial scholarship that came out of Africa. Whereas I think in the UK, there's less engagement with indigeneity and race and much more on issues of broader globalization and international development. So that's kind of my experience thus far. But I could certainly be wrong. I don't know if other people have other experiences on this.
But thanks, Farhana. Martina, Angela, I just wonder if you have any reflections.
Yeah, I will. I will concur with what Farhana said, and then I should also add, going back maybe to the previous question, that, for instance, in my work, with the IPCC and how you communicate with policymakers, these debates, these clear debates that we see centered around race, and climate here in the US, which are often scholarly debate and debates in, some say like circles, whether, led by NGOs or, civic organizations. It is very, very hard for those debates to actually trickle into the policymaking arena. And it is often because what policymakers are looking for are numbers, okay? Lots of cases, there are lots of case studies, there's lots of literature out there, but often what convinces policymakers are numbers. And so, which again, I'm not one that comes from a background of numbers, so I also have to accept this reality in my role for the IPCC. And that actually leads me to something I thought about, the question that I see some PhD students asking in the chat. They're like, I can't travel, what kind of work can I do online? What is like meaningful work that I can do from home? Very meaningful work that can be done from home and that will directly inform science, that then will directly go to policymakers, are systemic review and meta-analysis. Systemic review and meta-analysis are the restudy of studies that bring us to generalized conclusion, which as much as we don't like it as critical geographers, are actually easier to feed to policymakers. So, and with these, I've answered to 3 questions in one.
Thanks, Martina. And quickly, Michael, if you can add any thoughts to the question.
Yeah, I think the question of colonialism in the UK is the elephant in the room, because definitely I agree with Farhana that the academic interest, and maybe international policy interest is focused on the post-colony still, and that's definitely true. I think, though, I just want to mention that in my view, academics and activists in the UK are pretty much on their own when it comes to discussing colonialism or post-colonialism. The topic is not taught in any, to any acceptable degree, by me at least, in British schools. And I was a bit shocked when I arrived in this country and I realized that people who are 16, 17, 18 years old had never heard of colonialism, and the usual response is, well, I didn't do it. So you see that the problem here is there's a lot of work from the ground up that it needs to be done in the UK, and that's just starting on colonialism. That's not even making connections with climate justice and how it relates to climate change and how colonialism facilitated climate change and our emissions. So I think that part is a little bit different from the US, where I think there's a more, if I understood my time in the US correctly, I think there's a higher level of understanding, not necessarily of colonialism, but of these other kinds of oppressions, race-based oppressions, and so forth. So I think the public in the United States is more aware of these issues, like Native Americans and the history of slavery and so forth, compared to the UK. And I've also heard that the questions of gender in the US are not as heavily explored in the United States as in the UK or other places in Europe, on account of the racial issue, the race issue in the States. So that sometimes gets pushed aside, which was very interesting for me to see, because I would argue that it's the opposite in the UK.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for that. And I guess the next question kind of like revolves or it takes that discussion a little bit further. And there's a question around, can the systemic environmental racism present in the world today be separated from European colonization? Farhana, I just wonder if you want to give any reflections on that. You're on
Sorry, I
mute.
missed the question because I was responding to a question in the chat box. Yes.
Okay. Can the systemic environmental racism present in the world today be separated from European colonization?
No, not in my mind. But again, it depends on which kind of scholarly literature people are approaching it. So for instance, in the US, a lot of people who are working in environmental justice, which stemmed from the environmental racism scholarship, it's focused much more on, critical race theories and experiences of racialized groups in the US. But then you have indigenous scholars who've been talking much more in relation to North American colonization over time. So I think there's a lot of intersections there, but then there's also scholars who are talking about global racism. That racism just doesn't exist, in planet America, it exists planetarily. And it's those kind of relational racisms that exist. So I don't think you can talk about it separately, because a lot of the issues derived from different various, disruptions and ruptures that occurred through colonization, but also ongoing colonialities and ongoing processes of colonization, which often brand itself as globalization or international development. And this is why in one of the piece that I shared, which I think I need to reshare because apparently I shared it only with panelists and not with attendees, talks about issues about decolonizing, which basically means removing that Eurocentric gaze or Eurocentric scholarship in who we cite. So citational politics becomes important, who we teach, who we reference, who we invoke in scholarship, because what you need to do is kind of broaden that tapestry of what we mean by global racism, across scales and sites, and bring in different groups and communities and different types of languages in order to address the colonization, the ongoing racism that is simultaneously local and global.
Thanks, Farhana. And I'm just conscious of time, and I'm just going to ask one final question. I'm going to direct this to Martina, if I may. And I guess we couldn't have a conversation without mentioning COVID and the pandemic. Do you see a kind of like renewed attention? Will the COVID crisis lead to renewed attention towards climate justice and global governance agenda, or is it detracting from it?
So I will give you the two answers. I will give you the resident of the US answers, and I will give you the IPCC coordinating lead author answers. So I can tell you that in a way, the general debate over climate change has definitely been parked over COVID since March. I think it is coming back, and we're seeing more debate around the interconnection and how marginalization of people that are, that experience climate injustice, that are now also experiencing the fallout of COVID more prevalently. So it is coming back, but for a certain period of time at the very beginning of this crisis, I personally experienced that the debate was completely parked because the world attention completely shifted the other way. What I can tell you as an IPCC coordinating lead author is that The science is advancing extremely quickly. There's lots of evidence in relation to the intersection of climate change and COVID. And so that is going to be something that you will see more preponderantly in the scientific literature coming out. But again, at the moment, I think there's like a bit of a lag, right? Like science takes a bit longer to produce and then it's fed into the public debate. So I feel personally that they're going at two different speed in a way, if that answers the question.
Yes, it does, and it kind of like rounds up very nicely this Q&A session. So my thanks to you, Farhana, Martina, and Michael for powering through a very challenging set of questions. So many thanks for that. So again, just conscious of time, I think what we're going to do, I'm just going to provide a few remarks, just some closing remarks as to where I've seen the conversation head over the last kind of like hour or so. And it's very clear to me that the importance of the lived experiences should be front and center for all the work that we're doing in this area, and ensuring that the research and any kind of work through policy discourse and so on is grounded, and it reflects on the needs and priorities of the people who need support the most. And we're talking about a climate justice or injustice perspective. We know it's the poorest and the most vulnerable who have contributed least to carbon emissions that are suffering the most. So those groups need to be placed front and center, and then embracing all the different multiple sets of questions to try and understand even what those poorest groups look like through intersectionality approach, and certainly a lens to dig deep and drill deep and dig down into really understanding what needs to change. And we are looking at trying to achieve some sort of systemic change, radical change on the ground, and certainly in addressing inequalities. And referring to what Martina Angela said as well in her presentation, it's about finding those connections and working in an interdisciplinary way, because certainly in the way research is going, we need to and we must all work across disciplines and across boundaries and challenge ourselves, however uncomfortable it makes us. But I think unless we do that, we're not going to be able to come together, not just as an academic community, but a community and a society as a whole to address these global challenges moving forward. So they were just kind of like my closing remarks and reflections, but based on those wonderful presentations by our speakers today. So my sincere thanks to all of you for your wonderful insights. And this is an area of research that is underrepresented, but it needs to be at the forefront, certainly, of discourse going forward on climate change discourse. My thanks also to all of our guests. I know we're exhausted by Zoom meetings and webcams, calls, and so on. So I really appreciate you all joining us this afternoon. So what I want to do just before I go is just to make just a couple of announcements, to mention that the Centre for Climate Justice has launched its book series, a brand new book series, The Routledge Studies in Climate Justice. This is the first ever book series devoted to climate justice, and this builds on our existing collaboration with Routledge. And a couple of years ago, we launched our Climate Justice Handbook, so please do look out for that. But also, I want to mention a survey on developing an emancipatory research agenda, and this is certainly the onus behind why we've come together for you to provide your thoughts and ideas. And if you certainly would like to bring those discussions to this platform, then please do that, because like I said, this is an evolving an agenda, and it's something that we would certainly like to see grow as we move forward collaboratively. So with that in mind, I just want to refer you to our Twitter accounts. There are quite a few of them. If you can make note of them, please do follow us on our various Twitter accounts. You'll see them all there. And with that, I would just like again to say my heartfelt thanks to Farhana, Martina, and Michael. I don't know if you want to say a quick thanks and a close to everyone before we go.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for joining. We were absolutely overwhelmed with the interest, and also very happy to see that there is that level of interest in these topics, which we obviously hold very dear as researchers. So thank you.
Thanks. Farhana?
Sure. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you Tahsin and Michael for inviting me. This topic is definitely important. It is resurgent or insurgent, depending on how you look at it, but it seems new in scholarly and policy literatures, but it's always been in the background. Some of us have been working on it for a very long time. So, you know, I thank you, and I encourage everyone to engage. Some of us responded to questions in the chat box, which probably is not visible on the video webinar. So if you're not registered, you might not be receiving some of these resources and reading materials, but feel free to get in touch with any of us. My publications are available on my website. You know, you can download them there, and I'm sure Martina's is as well. So, you know, make use of the resources at hand. And, you know, thank you for engaging with this important work.
Thanks, Farhana. And Martina?
Yeah, I just want to again say thank you, Tahsin and Michael, for organizing this. This was very encouraging conversation for me. And I feel that, you know, in the time of Zoom fatigue, to have right now still 132 people on this, it's very, very encouraging. So, and I hope that you will keep contact with us, whether it's through our web pages, through our Twitter. We definitely want to keep this conversation going. So do not, especially I see to PhD students that might be sometimes timid, do not hesitate to get in contact with us. We are, you know, happy to continue the conversation, because it is what, like Farhana said, a conversation that we hold very close to our heart. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for your time this afternoon, and hopefully look forward to seeing you again on the next of our public engagement events. So everyone, thanks from everyone at the Centre for Climate Justice. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, bye.